Week 16 of the fantasy football season, and his running back start sits this week. The first start, Kyren Williams of the Los Angeles Rams. So Kyren Williams, what a season it's been for him. I know he missed 4 weeks in the middle weeks of the season, but now he's returned over the last month of the year. He's Kyren Williams, and he's gone out there and he's put up some great numbers, coming off once again a monster ball game versus the Washington Commanders. Kyren Williams went over 150 yards rushing and found the end zone this week here. Tougher matchup, no doubt about it, versus New Orleans Saints, where they've been pretty stout versus the run. I still think Kyren Williams, it doesn't matter to the matchup. He's been a matchup-proof running back all season. He fits this Sean McVay scheme perfectly. And this week, once again, versus the Saints, I think he goes out there and has a good game. Next start, Breece Hall of the New York Jets. So this Jet team, I know the offense has been a mess all season. Offensive line banged up, one of the worst lines in the league. It's been a quarterback carousel all season as well. Zach Wilson, it's gone from then Tim Boyle for a few games, then Trevor Siemian we saw coming into this game. But there's a slight chance Aaron Rodgers might return in this week's ball game. And to be honest, I don't think the Jets should bring Aaron Rodgers back. They're 5-9 in the season, but Rodgers possibly could be back in this ball game. But even if he's back or not, Breece Hall's a start for me. A good matchup this week versus the Washington Commanders that give up the second most fantasy points to running backs on the season. So I definitely would give him a start this week. The next start, Tony Pollard, the Dallas Cowboys. So Tony Pollard, he was on a nice span over the last few weeks until the Cowboys ran into a buzzsaw of the Buffalo Bills in that Week 15 blowout loss and couldn't get anything going. But this week at the Miami Dolphins, I think this Cowboy team, they'll at least be competent and move the football up and down the field. I don't know if they're going to win the game in Miami, but I think they'll have more success than they did in Buffalo moving the football. Tony Pollard's starting to get his legs on the room, because we got to remember last season he came off a terrible injury in the playoff, shattering that ankle, and it's just taking him time all season to get healthy, but he's definitely looked quicker. He's definitely been breaking tackles a little bit more over the last few weeks. And this week, after a bad ball game altogether for the Cowboys, he's back in the starting lineup once again. Next start, James Conner of the Arizona Cardinals. So James Conner, the last 2 weeks, he's gone out there and he's played good football in tougher matchups, especially versus the 49ers, getting 17 fantasy points in PPR leagues. It was a pretty nice ball game for James Conner. So this week, a great matchup at the Chicago Bears. The defense we know can't really stop anyone is this Bear DST, and I think James Conner could go out there and have a good ball game once again. He's looked explosive. We know he missed a few games early in the season as well, going on IR where he was out, but now he's been back in the last 2 out of 3 weeks. He's had some big ball games, is Conner, and once again he's a start. This offense at least has been moving the football with Kyler Murray back in the offense with Trey McBride and Conner out of the backfield. Next start, Aaron Jones of the Green Bay Packers. Aaron Jones finally returned in last week's ball game, and it wasn't a great game, only 11 fantasy points in PPR leagues versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But Aaron Jones, he looked healthy in that one. We know A.J. Dillon missed last week's game with a broken thumb, and this week a great matchup with the Carolina Panthers, one of the worst teams in the league, obviously 2-12 on the season, and they give up the third most fantasy points to running backs on the season. So I think Aaron Jones could go out there. He looked pretty healthy coming off the hamstring injury, and he's a running back I'll have confidence as a number 2 back or flex option as a start this week. The next start, Javonte Williams of the Denver Broncos. So Javonte Williams, he's been a running back where it depends on game script this season, if he's had a good game or not. And over the last couple weeks, obviously the game script hasn't been in his favor. Last weekend blown out at the Detroit Lions, where he barely touched the football and only had 4 fantasy points in PPR leagues. But this week he had a nice matchup versus the New England Patriots, a DST that don't really stop anyone. And we just saw Clyde Edwards-Helaire come off a nice ball game. I think he could go out there, Javonte Williams, and have a nice game versus this Patriot team in a game script where it's either going to be a close game between these two teams or the Broncos will be playing ahead with a lead. So right now, Javonte Williams, I know it's been a bad few weeks in a row where he's pretty much been topping out at 10, 11 fantasy points and coming off of 4 points in last week's matchup. But this week he's a start in the final start, Derrick Henry of the Tennessee Titans. So last week I know it was a poor ball game, no doubt about it, for Derrick Henry, where he didn't even average 1 yard per carry, surprisingly, in a matchup versus the Houston Texans, where their run defense was middle of the pack. They weren't the greatest run defenses, but they definitely shut down Derrick Henry. But this week I think Derrick Henry bounces back. The other week it seems like it's been one good week, one bad week for Derrick Henry. But this week versus Seattle, that gives up the 5th most fantasy points to running backs on the season. I think Henry bounces back, and this team's going to rely on him a little bit more in this one. After last week, they got off to a nice start and just couldn't close the deal out versus Houston. So he's a start now to the sits. Austin Eckler of the Los Angeles Chargers. I didn't expect this late in the year to be calling Austin Eckler a sit, but he just hasn't produced. He hasn't reached double-digit fantasy points really at all. Only once in the last 5 weeks Eckler has. And this week in a tough matchup versus the Buffalo Bills, where their defense over the last few weeks is starting to get things going and stop the run. And they're trying to play for one of those last playoff spots. This Charger team, Eckler's not being the man over there getting the full workload. We saw Joshua Kelly and Isaiah Spiller get a lot of work. And this week with a tough matchup and Eckler not getting touches like I mentioned, he's a sit. Next sit, Najee Harris of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And Najee Harris, he had a couple decent bounce-back weeks. It's 3 weeks now. He's failed to reach double-digit fantasy points. And this team, each week, the offense seems like it gets worse. Now might be Mason Rudolph starting a quarterback for this Pittsburgh Steelers team. Mitchell Trubisky was that bad, and we saw Rudolph come later in that ball game versus the Colts. So, like I said, Najee Harris all season, he really hasn't had speed. He really hasn't had pop and burst out of the offensive line, with Jalen Warren being the better running back. Over the last few weeks with nothing going, he's definitely a sit. Next sit, Gus Edwards of the Baltimore Ravens. So Gus Edwards, he's been a touchdown-dependent running back all season. If he's not getting touchdowns, he's not putting up fantasy points. Week with a tough matchup with the 49ers that give up the fourth least amount of fantasy points to running backs on the season. And if Gus Edwards, the last few weeks, really hasn't done anything, he's a sit. Alexander Madison is sit for me as well with the Minnesota Vikings. Alexander Madison, it's been an up-and-down season for him, no doubt about it. And even this Minnesota Viking team, I believe, didn't have 100% confidence in him after trading for Cam Akers early in the season. Cam Akers, he got hurt week 9, week 10 with that torn Achilles, out for the season. And this week here in a matchup versus Detroit, their run defense is pretty solid, giving up the 5th least amount of fantasy points to running backs on the season. And with Ty Chandler playing good football over the last couple weeks, no way in a Final Four matchup or the finals here I would have confidence in Alexander Madison at my running back position. What the fact is, with a tougher matchup and with Ty Chandler playing well, next at Deonta Foreman of the Chicago Bears, it's pretty much 3-headed backfield over there with Khalil Herbert, Deonta Foreman, and Roschon Johnson, but pretty much no running backs over there have been impressive at all over the last few weeks for the Chicago Bear team. So I know this week it's a good matchup versus the Arizona Cardinals, where their run defense really isn't good at all. And we just saw Christian McCaffrey, even though he's the best running back easily in the league this season, go off for a monster ball game over 35 fantasy points. I don't see Foreman or Herbert or any of these backs really get consistency where they could go out there and have a big game. So he's a sit for me. Kareem Hunt, the next sit of the Cleveland Browns. So Kareem Hunt, at this point of his career, he's just a change of pace back, and a guy's going to get some carries. And there was a reason this offseason no one signed him until Nick Chubb went down early in the year. Then the Browns brought him in. So this week in a matchup at Houston where they shut down Derrick Henry in last week's ball game, Kareem Hunt's going to be a sit for me as well. Like I said, he's not bringing anything for fantasy owners. At this point, he's been a name. And in this offense, they just run the football to keep teams off guard a little bit. Because for the most part, it's been Joe Flacco dropping back and throwing a ton. And running back, I look to sit this week's A.J. Dillon of the Green Bay Packers. Dillon missed last week's ball game with a broken thumb. And now with Aaron Jones back in the mix, I don't really think A.J. Dillon is going to have any fantasy value. I know Dillon had a lot of weeks where he was the man in the backfield getting a lot of carries and a lot of touches. But to be honest, he really wasn't putting up fantasy numbers with a guy who had a good workload for this Green Bay Packer team. So this Packer team's more of a pass-first type of team anyway. Dillon, he's a middle-of-the-pack type of receiver out of the backfield. But with Aaron Jones back in the mix and his numbers not really up there this season, where his ceiling was pretty much 10-12 fantasy points in PPR leagues. If he comes back this week, he's a sit, even in a good matchup at the Panthers that give up the 3rd most fantasy points to backs on the season. So that's running back start sits for Week 16 of the fantasy football season.